So what I wanted to talk to you today we're supposed to be talking about radicalization in the prison system, or the prison system. Is it a hotbed for radicalization or for reform? What is the role that Islam can play in preventing radicalization and reforming people that may be incarcerated or may be prone to recidivism or along those lines? What I would like to speak to you today about are three main issues. Number one is, how legitimate is the charge that radicalization is rampant in the U.S. prison system? Number two, what challenges does government involvement pose to the process of de-radicalization? And number three, how can Muslim beliefs become an effective tool for change and positive reform of prisoners and in prisons? Now, when we're discussing about the issue of prison radicalization, it's very important first to challenge the notion of its existence. And I'm asking, as a non-specialist in that area, I don't have the empirical data, but is there sufficient empirical data that is being provided by those who are making claims that radicalization is happening at a rampant rate in the U.S. prison systems? As Dr. Ridley said, yes, there is susceptibility, but is it actually happening? That's a question that we have to ask, and we cannot just answer in the affirmative based upon biases that we carry about people who are incarcerated, about Muslims, or the nature of Islam, or any other minority faith group in the United States. To further claims like this is to malign a community and is not only bad character, but it's bad policy. It also cannot go without saying that assumptions about radicalization play heavily into prevailing prejudices in the American psyche, whether those be race-based prejudices as members of an ethnicity being predisposed to criminal intent and action, or religion-based prejudice functioning the same way. Many times, these two prejudices are intertwined. Islam is seen as the reason for extremism amongst many minority groups, and minority groups are seen as sympathetic to what is labeled as extremism in the minds of majoritarian members of society. In essence, this line of thought, i.e., race-based or religion-based prejudice, attempts to pin the causes of extremism and radicalization on something outside of and foreign to the American cultural psyche, namely seen as Judeo-Christian, civilized, and of European background. The racialized tones of many of the discussions on this issue lend credence to this. However, my comments here today will not focus on the empirical data, and instead, for had that been the case, I would be speaking to you not in my role as a member of the American Muslim community, nor in my role as a thought leader in that community, but instead as a member of one demographic that data has shown is most predisposed to violent extremism and homegrown terror, namely middle-aged white American males. What I do want to talk to you today about, and what my comments will focus on, are the epistemological challenges of those who have to straddle what seem to be competing value systems. The values of freedom of religion, speech and expression, the value of reasonable accommodation for those who are incarcerated. On one side, we have these values. On the other side, we have religious affiliations and ideologies and beliefs that may be opposed or seem to be opposed at times to the systems that seek to protect it. And let me give you an example. If I, as an American, and this is not my belief, but if I were to say that I believe it is wrong for any American to have access to a firearm regardless of what type it is, I believe that all firearms should be banned. This is a belief which goes against a core constitutionally protected right. However, my adopting this belief does not forfeit my right to be protected by all of those other constitutional rights that are afforded to me. The question then becomes, is protecting beliefs and values that are not normative or not popular? If we do so, are we in some sense going against our own values in favor of another value system? Those who we see as conservative or extreme, when we protect their rights to hold those beliefs and to practice those beliefs within the confines of American law, does that mean that we are enabling illicit practices or endangering the American public? Additionally, is it appropriate for us to label those that we see as conservative, austere, or beyond our own scope of practice as something which is extreme or veers off towards the path of radicalization? When such labeling becomes a matter of policy, this is where the problem grows. So there's an obvious danger from the government exceeding its boundaries and going beyond mere religious accommodation to religious dictation, dictating to any individual or any group the belief and or beliefs and practices that are considered legitimate or a legitimate form of that faith. If viewed solely through the lens of national security, it would seem to make sense to challenge the ideas that lead to radicalization. And I think that we can agree that those do need to be challenged. But when the assumption is that radicalization is, or especially when the assumption is that radicalization effectively counters terrorism and protects the American public. So why shouldn't government officials try to marginalize what they view as theology cited by violent extremists, one that poses a danger not only to individuals, but to society at large? The problem is that when governments attempt to dictate to anyone their religious beliefs, they create a myriad of legal and strategic tensions. For the practitioner of that religion that is targeted by that government, this government-sponsored religion appears to be a faith which is foreign to their own and one that they do not recognize. And in the context of the broader Muslim community, it appears that the government is playing favorites and rereading their religion through national security contexts, dictating to them what is and is not acceptable. This would contravene the basic rights enshrined in the Constitution that everyone, regardless of faith, expects to be afforded to them under law. And this is then exacerbated when the target populations that make up the majority of Muslim communities come from backgrounds where the expectation from government is that they intervene to the detriment of the individual. Whether it be the historical memories of programs like COINTELPRO or the security apparatuses of foreign governments, persecuting even the most basic performance of faith, such as prayer in the mosque, as happens in many Muslim-majority countries, U.S. government programs that seek to dictate to Muslims what their beliefs are or should be will naturally cause mistrust and inadvertently push people away and towards radicalism, not away from it. Even indirect influence into the community's thought process can be seen as suspect, and many times is. Programs that seek to co-opt leadership in the Muslim community, such as PREVENT or CVE, for the purpose of combating radicalization, will oftentimes have the opposite effect. When the individuals that represent religious authority in the community are seen as puppets or compromised, then we cannot expect those who would lean towards radical beliefs to confide in them and to reform their ideas. We certainly can't expect them to stay away, as they will consistently try to mend the rift created from what they see as a compromised religious ideal. And by expecting a breach of confidentiality from pastors, imams, chaplains, and those who work in religious functions in Muslim communities, we compromise the effectiveness of religious authority to be a positive force in de-radicalization. The solution, in my humble opinion, lies in not just creating institutions and initiatives that are grounded in faith, socially relevant and legally viable, but in reevaluating what it means to have religious leadership. Who really is an imam? Who really is a chaplain? What authority do they have and who speaks for Islam? What sort of faith do we have in our texts and what sort of trust do we have in those entrusted to interpret it? If we can't answer this question as a Muslim community and instead allow ourselves to interpret it, then how are our personal interpretations or the interpretations of a government more authoritative or valid than those of others, say radicals? Here, I feel it's important to mention as well that Muslim communities themselves can not only denounce radical beliefs, but they must see themselves as partners and be seen as partners by organizations and government authorities that want to work with them to combat the co-opting of their beliefs for any purpose, whether that be for national security assumptions or to promote extreme acts that will damage society as a whole, at home or abroad. So the question then is, how can Muslim beliefs be used for positive change and reform of people prone to radicalization? With regards to the national security interests, government policies, the policies of correctional institutions, what is needed is an open door policy for religiously affiliated or qualified individuals to be able to counsel, teach, and advise incarcerated individuals that may be susceptible to radicalization. With regards to chaplains and those working in the rehabilitation of prisoners, it's absolutely imperative that a theology of personal choice and a theology of personal responsibility be inculcated in them and all those that are under their supervision. Speaking from a Muslim theological perspective, this means that the basic beliefs of Islam are taught to those individuals in a fashion that does not play into the tropes of any one radicalist or extreme group. Chaplains and other individuals, as well as lay people themselves, may subscribe to a more conservative or liberal point of view about their own faith. But we have to recognize that it is not one individual perspective of religion, whether that be Islam or any other religion, that is susceptible to being co-opted by radicals or extremists. Indeed, we've seen in the past 2 years how versions of Sunni Islam, of Shia Islam, and even of Sufi Islam in the events that occurred in Turkey have shown us that regardless of religious orientation, each of these groups may be co-opted for political purposes. One of the hallmarks of radicalist belief is their tendency to engage in groupthink, negating from the individual their personal autonomy and their ability to make their own decisions, and instead demanding from them dogmatic, rote application of the group's ideals. It's imperative for any chaplain or teacher of those susceptible to radicalization to present the general precepts of Islam and how first and foremost every individual believer be held accountable for their actions and their beliefs. In several verses of the Quran, this idea of personal responsibility is reiterated. Every soul shall be accountable for what it earns, says one verse, and in another, no soul shall bear the burden of another, and in yet another, every soul shall be concerned with itself on the day of judgment. In one prophetic tradition, a man came out of the desert and he asked the Prophet Muhammad if he only prayed his prayers and fasted his fast and gave his charity and did the basics of Islam, would he enter paradise? And the Prophet said emphatically, yes. When he left, the Prophet turned to his companions and he said to them, if he is true to his word, then he will indeed enter paradise. In another tradition, the Prophet said, the Muslim is the one who people are safe from his tongue and his hands. The believer is the one who the people are secure from. And the immigrant, or the emigrant, the muhajir, is the one who migrated away from sinfulness. In another tradition, he says, whoever kills a person whom they are in covenant with, they have a social contract with, then they will not smell the scent of paradise, even though its scent can be smelled from a distance of 70 autumns. A bit of allegory there in the words used. So tying this to what's related as points of historical memory or points of consensus in early Muslim scholarship is important as well, so that those who are susceptible to radicalization can see that the ideas of being civic or having civic duty and personal responsibility have primacy not only in Islamic texts, but have been upheld as ideals from the earliest Muslim generations. The key here is inculcating in people the ability to make informed religious choices, and that their religiously motivated practices be made consciously by themselves. Those who are susceptible to the nuances and they must be taught that the ultimate responsibility of each and every one of them falls upon themselves to ensure both their personal and public safety. teaching the Muslim individual, whether incarcerated or not, that they have a civic duty towards their fellow man and a personal responsibility in front of God to fulfill that duty, is paramount. It will only be through the teaching of Islamic beliefs and their broadest sense that will create a sense of identity in the religiously practicing individual, that they will be protected from possible radicalization. What this does is it creates in the mind of the practicing believer that their personal private practice does not and should not dictate the minimums of public religiosity. So while I as an individual may be more conservative or more austere in my approach and practice of religion, I am not expected, nor should I force that upon the public. In fact, what I'm expected to do as a religious practitioner is to guarantee for the public their personal safety from myself and from anyone who would want to do them harm. So by encouraging those susceptible to take personal responsibility for their actions and pairing those actions with being held accountable by God himself without any help or assistance from those close to them, along with prophetic traditions that we mentioned, those working in the service and education of incarcerated individuals can be the preventative cure to any lapses in judgment and possible engagement with radicalized groups. And to sum up, my long run-on sentence to you all, charges that radicalization is a problem, and specifically charges that radicalization to Islamic extremism is a problem, need to be substantiated with hard numbers so that they are not used as a tool for propaganda seeking to marginalize Muslims both in and outside of prisons. When government officials attempt to dictate religious beliefs, they create a myriad of legal and strategic tensions, effectively contravening both American values and jeopardizing and or reversing the desired effects of de-radicalization. And this pitfall can be avoided by governmental agencies partnering with, not targeting or sponsoring, Muslims with the requisite expertise necessary for positive change and reform of prisoners and those that are inclined to radicalization. Muslim chaplains, imams, experts, and community leaders can effect positive change through encouraging theologically grounded concepts of personal responsibility, civic duty, and accountability to God, rooting this in historical memory and enabling those individuals to take personal agency in their religiously motivated practices.